Okay, in chapter 5, we're going to talk about measurement, how we define our concepts, and how we operationalize them. So measurement can be difficult and imprecise. So we want to describe, whenever we're writing a proposal or writing up our research, we want to describe exactly why we measured things the way we did and how we measured them. Okay, so we want to move from a vague idea like happiness to something more specific. Okay, otherwise we can't really tell our audience what we've learned or how it applies to them. So conception refers to like this mental image we might have about something, right? So something like crime, mental health, psychological well-being. And then concepts are words, phrases, or symbols in our language that represent these images. Things like gender, punishment, delinquency, intelligence. What do these concepts mean? So there's 3 different things that scientists can measure. One is something that's directly observable, the color of something, its shape, its height, right? We can observe that directly. There's a lot of things that we're going to measure and look at in research that we have to measure indirectly or observe indirectly. That could be things like criminal history records, court transcripts, reports, right? Those are written documents that are measuring something indirectly. Constructs are theoretical creations. We can't observe them directly or indirectly. So something like happiness, joy, justice. How do we measure those things? So we want to make sure we're always specifying precisely what we mean when we use particular terms. A lot of times we're going to be looking to the prior research to tell us what that means. And we're going to then specify what indicators we're looking for. Okay, so conceptualization produces a specific agreed upon meaning. So when we talk about violent crime, what do we mean? We mean an offender uses force or threatens to use force against a victim. You might even want to refine that further and talk about what do you mean by force. Now, when we think about our concepts, they have a dimension, right? It's something, some aspects of it that we can specify. And an indicator is an observation we choose to consider that reflects that variable we want to study. So, for example, victim harm might be a dimension we want to study. And things we might look at as indicators of the harm done to victims might be physical injury, broken bones, lacerations, economic loss, costs, psychological consequences. Okay? The more specific we can be, the better and deeper our understanding is. Now, if several indicators all represent the same concept, they should behave in the same way. Now, concepts are abstract and they're mental creations. And so the terms we use to describe them don't always have concrete meanings. What do we mean by stress? What do we mean by wellness, poverty, delinquency? Okay? Reification refers to the process of taking those sort of things and regarding them as real. So we want to think about a conceptual definition. So when we're thinking about something like socioeconomic status, right, we kind of have a working definition that's we specifically assign to it, helps us focus our observations. And then we have an operational definition, right? And that's when we're going to operationalize our variables. We are going to spell out precisely how we will measure that. Are we going to measure that by income, by wealth, by the prestige of the job one has? So when we operationalize something, we're giving it an operational definition, which makes it so that we can actually measure that, okay? So it's the development of specific research procedures that will give us those empirical observations. Now, measurement could be assigning numbers to something. It could be assigning labels to units in order to represent those concepts. We would make observations and maybe assign a score to them. Now, this is more difficult in social science research because, again, we're looking at concepts that might be hard to measure. And definitions can become problematic for descriptive research they're more problematic when we're talking about descriptive research. How precise you need to be really varies depending on the type of study you're doing and what you're trying to look at. So we're going to start with conceptualization, then we're going to have a concept definition, we're going to operationalize that, and then we're actually going to go out and measure it. So what are the different meanings of social class? Okay, and then for our study, we're going to define social class as economic differences, specifically income. So we're going to measure that by asking on a survey, what was your annual income before taxes last year? So the interviewer will literally ask that question. Every variable should have two measures, two qualities. It should be exhaustive and mutually exclusive, right? So we should be able to classify every observation in terms of one of those answer choices, right? So if I'm going to put color as my variable, right, I have to make sure I have all the colors that are there, okay? Now, that doesn't mean every hue on the planet, right? But like maybe you have all the Roy G. Bivs and then you have other, okay? Should be mutually exclusive. Everything should fit only one category, okay? So employment status, right? That should probably include things like full-time, part-time, unemployed student, full-time student, part-time student, right? And they should be mutually exclusive. Now you guys will remember this fun stuff from statistics. When we're measuring things, we can measure them at 4 different levels. This is really important because when we're collecting and gathering our data, it's generally to our benefit to measure it as precisely as possible because you can always aggregate that data, but you can't expand that data if you didn't collect it that way. So if I collect ages as like under 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, I can't turn around and expand that. But if I ask you for your specific age, I can turn around and group them into 10 to 20, 20 to 30, etc. So nominal measurements are names and labels only, okay? They are exhaustive and mutually exclusive. Gender, religion, college major, hair color, birthplace, nationality. A lot of things in our fields are nominal. Ordinal means they can be ranked in an order that makes sense. That could be socioeconomic status, conflict, prejudice. But it does mean that they're not equidistant. Interval and ratio are equidistant. So something like temperature, an IQ score, age, length of time, things like that. So for instance, gender would be a nominal level measure, male, female, and obviously today we would want to be more expansive with that. An ordinal could be religiosity. How important is religion to you? Not very important, fairly important, very important, most important thing in my life. That might look to you like it's an interval level measurement because it looks like a Likert scale, but technically it's not, okay? Interval level measure might be like IQ and ratio. We're going to treat interval and ratio the same for our purposes. So this matters because it impacts what kind of analysis we can do, okay? We can't take a lower level of measurement and make it higher, but we can take a higher level of measurement and make it lower. So if you have the opportunity to collect, gather, write your own survey questions, you should always ask for it as precisely as possible. And this should look familiar to you if you took statistics, because I handed this out as a handout. Okay. Quality measures are going to be reliable and valid. Measurement can be made with varying degrees of precision. We know that the more precise, the better, but we don't have to be completely precise. And precision and accuracy are not the same thing. Now, reliability is whether your particular measurement technique repeatedly applied to the same object would get the same result, right? So if I'm measuring something in inches, every time I measure one specific thing, it should give me the same answer, okay? That doesn't mean it's the correct answer. It doesn't mean it's accurate. It just means that your method of measurement is reliable. So some of the ways we can make sure our data is reliable is the test-retest method. So we make the same measurement more than once, and we check those responses to make sure they're the same. You might have seen this in a survey before where you're like, didn't I answer this question already? We can also use an inter-rater reliability test. We can have several different people rate something and compare their measures. And then we can use a split half method, which is where we make more than one measure of any concept and see if the measures measure the concept differently. It's like we could measure poverty in different ways. So reliability is one thing, validity is something else, okay? Does the measure you're using actually capture your concept? Okay, so reliability is like every time you measure it and every person who measures it should get the same answer. Okay, validity is, are you really measuring what you think you're measuring? And this is harder to demonstrate. So something can be valid on its face, right? On its face, does it seem valid? Does it sort of like, comport with our agreements and our images of something? We could compare it to some sort of criteria. We could look to see, does it relate to something else in a way that makes sense? We could do alternative measures. So a good measurement technique should be both valid and reliable, okay? So our first picture here is reliable but not valid, okay? Our middle one is valid but not reliable, and our last one is valid and reliable. So just remember, valid means it's measuring what you think it's measuring, and reliable means every time you measure it, you should get the same answer. So who decides what's valid? Well, we should look to prior research for this, right? Do we have validated scales already? So sometimes people have already developed ways of measuring some of these abstract concepts, and they've been used repeatedly, and it's been tested, and we consider that to be valid. We can also use what's called a composite measure, right? So if we have many measures available to us that indicate poverty, we might be able to look for a composite measure, okay? We might use several variables together to create an index or a scale. Okay, so this is a little something from some of my research, okay? So following Morinoff, Sampson, and Raudenbush, Mustaine, and Sampson, Raudenbush, and Earl, right? So that's referencing 3 prior pieces of research. These variables are calculated using principal component analysis, okay? I know you're like, what? Okay, PCA is just a way of building a scale or a composite, okay? And so I built 2. I built one for concentrated disadvantage and one for immigrant concentration, okay? By the way, I use statistics to build these, but they also match how other folks have already been measuring both of these concepts, okay? So concentrated disadvantage includes the percentage of family below the poverty line, percentage of families receiving public assistance, percentage of population unemployed, and percentage of single female-headed households. Okay, so those are all things that are indicators of poverty, right? Immigrant concentration is percentage of Latinos in a community, percentage of foreign-born individuals in a community. Okay, these are both concepts already developed from this first bullet point, Sampson, Raudenbush. They're kind of like the main people who've developed these. Okay, and so here's just a correlation matrix of this, right? It's telling you, if you look at all the ones that are starred, statistics, friends, this is literally the last concept we learned, where we looked at R, right? And we looked for it to be the closer it was to 1, the stronger the relationship. So you can see that things like, unemployment and percent poverty and percent SNAP are correlated with each other, right? So that means we don't want to use them as separate individual measures, okay? We want to put them together as a composite measure, which we'll talk about a little bit more, I think, in the next chapter.